Hello, everyone, again. And we have been talking that today in the United States is Mother's Day. And we played a song this morning for those of you who are maybe viewing this recording after the fact. The song by Kathy Tricoli called Go Light Your World. And there's a lyric in that song, carry your candle, run to the darkness. And this morning, I want to talk about 3 women in the Bible who did that with amazing courage and trust. One, a mother of children. The second one, a mother of Israel. And the third one, actually a city that's a mother. But there's a wise woman who saved that city from destruction. So we'll go first to Exodus chapter 2. And this is the story of the birth of a very special son. And it's written so matter-of-factly and so unassumingly that you really have to think about what's not said and what's between the lines. So we'll start in verse 1. A man of the house of Levi went and took a daughter of Levi as his wife. And the context here is Egypt. The children of Israel were enslaved in Egypt at this time. Interesting that the parents aren't even named, but their bloodline is. Levi was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and Jacob and his 11 sons ended up in Egypt because of a famine. And the one son, Joseph, was already there. And you can read all about that throughout the book of Genesis. But Levi was the 3rd son of Jacob, and he would have been the first generation to dwell in Egypt. So we know about their bloodline. We don't know their names. The woman conceived and bore a son. When she saw that he was special, she hid him 3 months. Now, a lot in that verse. So first of all, she saw that he was special. What is that talking about? Other verses of scripture say that he was beautiful before God, this son. She knew, the mom and the dad knew in their spirit that this son was special to God. Now, do we know that they knew a lot of detail? No, we don't. But they knew spiritually that God's favor was upon this child and he was special. Now, why did she have to hide him for 3 months? Well, we read in Exodus 1 that the Pharaoh had issued a new decree that the Hebrew midwives were to kill every male child immediately at birth, and they were to let the female children live. We also know that they didn't obey that command. And they were called before Pharaoh, and he confronted them about that. And they said, well, the Hebrew women are vigorous and they give birth before the midwives get there, which may or may not have been entirely true. But anyway, so this mom hid her baby boy for 3 months. Now, it's interesting that there were other children in the household that aren't mentioned here. There's an older sister whose name was Miriam, and an older brother whose name was Aaron. And Aaron was 3 years older than Moses, but there's no mention of the mom having to hide the toddler, only the baby. And that, to me, if you read Exodus 1 thoroughly, it gives you an idea of the escalating cruelty and hardship that the Pharaoh and his officers were exerting over the Israelites, that she would have to hide this young son when she had a toddler running around the house as well. And when she could hide him no longer, verse 3, she took a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and with pitch. She put the child in it and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. Note, she did not float the basket down the Nile. She hid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And verse 4, his sister, that would be Miriam, stood far off to see what would be done to him. Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe at the river, and her servant girls walked along the riverside. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant girl to get it. Now, this is where you have to read between the lines. Imagine the preparation, the prayer, the tears, the planning that went into this event. It wasn't happenstance that Moses, the baby, was placed in a specific spot on the river. It wasn't happenstance that the mom knew where Pharaoh's daughters came to bathe. Now, and it wasn't happenstance that the sister was posted not too far away to watch what an outcome might be. And from our vantage point, having all of this written down, and we know all about this baby and what he became in life, it's so easy just to read this as a matter of fact thing. But the mom, the dad, the sister didn't know what would be the outcome of this event. Maybe the child would drown. Maybe the child would be murdered. Maybe, who knew? But it was their prayer and their trust and their hope for the best possible outcome, and God honored that. Think about it. If she knew, the mom knew, I can't hide this baby any longer, where would he be safe? Certainly not anywhere in the Israelite community in Egypt, but he would be safe in Pharaoh's house. How do I get him in there? Can't just go knocking on the door. So she, through her prayer and her trust, hatched this plan that might work out and might not. There were so many elements of this that could have gone terribly wrong. So she learned where the daughters of Pharaoh's bathed. I'm sure it wasn't their first time. They didn't just pick a new spot that day. This was all part of an unfolding plan. And so many of the details had to fall into place perfectly. So in verse 6, this is Pharaoh's daughter, opened the basket and saw the child, and behold, the baby cried. She had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Interesting that the plan of the mom was to get the baby as possibly connected with women, because they would have the compassion and that mother instinct. Sons of Pharaoh may not have responded that way at all. In verse 7, then his sister, that's Miriam, said to Pharaoh's daughter. Now, interesting, Miriam still would have been a child. I don't know if there's any scriptures that exactly give us Miriam's age or how much older she was than Aaron or Moses. But if she were, say, 15 or older, she wouldn't have been living in her parents' home. She would have been married by then. So here is this older sister who is still herself, just a child, walked right up to Pharaoh's daughter and said, should I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women so that she can nurse the child for you? So here is this hopeful plan unfolding right then and there. And Miriam is right on it. She just stepped right up and couldn't show her elation. She had to be very nonchalant about it, or she would have blown the whole thing, right? And the Pharaoh's daughter in verse 8 said to her, go. So the young girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you wages. I'll pay you to take care of your own child. So the woman took the child and nursed it. And again, imagine the mom's elation that this happened in the absolute best possible way it could have unfolded, and the discipline that she had not to show it, which would have given everything away and ruined the plan. And also, she would have known at this moment that there would come a day in the future that she would have to bring that baby back, and how that must have felt. So the woman took the child and nursed it in verse 9. And then verse 10, the child grew and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses and said, because I drew him out of the water. And Moses at that time might have been 3. You know, the Hebrews nursed their children a whole lot longer than culturally we do currently. So here is Moses's mom taking a 3-year-old back to Pharaoh's daughter and let him go. And you can just imagine the crushing weight of what it took to do that. But here's a woman of faith, decisive action, courage, and certainly integrity. It's interesting that we learn from other scriptures like Exodus 6:20 and Numbers 26:59, the names of the parents. The dad is Amram and the mom is Jochebed. Something else that's interesting about this record is that hundreds of years prior, in Genesis 15:16, God told Abraham that he would bring the Israelites out of Israel in the 4th generation. Levi was the 1st generation. Levi had a son, Kohath, 2nd generation. Kohath had a son, Amram, 3rd generation. And Amram had a son, Moses, 4th generation. Now, did Amram and Jochebed know of that prophecy? That's a big question mark, because none of the Bible had been written by this time. None of the scriptures were recorded. There were oral traditions, obviously. So there's a possibility that they might have known something about the 4th generation. There were other prophecies about God's deliverance of his people out of Israel, but the prophecies weren't specific as to how they would be delivered. So what we do know is that Amram and Jochebed were full of faith and trust. They were extraordinarily courageous, and they knew that their son was special to God. And of course, you know, the whole story of Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and so forth. Moses did deliver the Israelites from their slavery in Egypt. And he was 83, by the way, when or 80, Aaron was 83, when they went back to Pharaoh and the whole plagues and pled for the liberation of the Israelites. And then, of course, you know that Moses nurtured and led the children of Israel 40 years in the wilderness. He received the law by revelation from God. He met God. He built the tabernacle. I mean, he was a giant and a father of trust to Israelites. And if you hop over real quickly to Hebrews 11, there's a statement in here in verse 23 about Moses's parents. By trust, when Moses was born, he was hidden by his parents for 3 months because they saw he was beautiful before God, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. It's a wonderful example of a mom who carried her candle, ran to the darkness. What a wonderful illustration of trust and the courageous action born of it. So the next mom I want to talk about is one who is called a mother of Israel. And we'll go to Judges chapter 5. This is Deborah. And I'll give you a little background about this story. So what a judge is and so forth. So Moses led the children of Israel to the brink of the promised land, but then God prohibited him from going in. He showed him by revelation the whole land. But that work fell on Joshua, Moses' successor, and Joshua led the conquest of the promised land and led the children of Israel into the promised land, and then divided the land into the tribal areas that are originated with the 12 sons of Jacob. The problem is that after the land was allotted to the various tribes, the tribal leaders and their warriors were supposed to clean out the remainder of the inhabitants of all of their tribal areas, and they didn't do it. They didn't carry that out. And because of that, for hundreds and hundreds of years following that time, the children of Israel were oppressed and suffered. And the book of Judges picks up after Joshua and the distribution of the land. And the reason it's called Judges is that this was about as much government as Israel had at that time. They were wise people, they were leaders, sometimes prophets, who would guide the children of Israel, settle disputes, sometimes speak from the Lord, that sort of thing. So that's who the judges are. And Judges 5 talks about a judge who was a woman, and her name was Deborah. And all of Judges 5 is a victory song, and it's sung by Deborah, but I wanted to point out a couple of verses of it. And it's a victory song after a battle that she was instrumental in, and that God came forth and delivered the children of Israel. So if you look at Judges chapter 5, verse 6, these verses describe the oppression that the children of Israel were under at the hands of the Canaanites in this particular record. So in verse 6, in the days of Shagmar, the son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the main roads were unoccupied. The travelers took winding side roads. Village life ceased in Israel. They ceased until I, Deborah, arose, until I arose, a mother in Israel. Israel chose new gods, not Yahweh. Then war was in the gates. Was there a shield or a spear seen among 40,000 in Israel? So what is this describing is the absence of community, the absence of prosperity, the abandonment of Yahweh. One of the things that happened with the children of Israel, because they didn't clean out the pagan inhabitants of the land that were there before them, they lived among them and were influenced by their spiritual practices, by their idols, and all of that. So when, that's what it means when it says a new God. The Israel chose new gods. They weren't imposed on them, they chose. They abandoned Yahweh and chose new gods. And so there was war, there was oppression, there was poverty, there was hiding. That's why they weren't walking on the main highways. And they had been disarmed. There was not a weapon seen, a shield or spear seen among 40,000 men in Israel. Then she says, my heart is toward the leaders of Israel who offered themselves willingly among the people. Bless Yahweh. And this is an expression of her relief when the leaders of Israel, in this case, his name was Barak, finally rose up and said, we're going to stand against this oppression, and we're going to fight, and we're going to implore Yahweh to bring deliverance to us. So hop back to chapter 4, and we'll look a little bit about this record. So we'll start in verse 1. The children of Israel again did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh when Ehud was dead. Ehud was a judge that preceded Deborah. And once he was dead and no longer leading, they went back to, absorbing the pagan practices of the people of the land. And so Yahweh sold them into the hand of Jabin, the king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor, the commander of whose army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Haggayim. And the Yahweh sold them is a figure of speech. It's called the idiom of permission. What it means is the people turned away and Yahweh could no longer work on their behalf. And then verse 3, the children of Israel cried out to Yahweh, for he, Sisera, the general of the Canaanites, had 900 chariots of iron, and for 20 years he had severely oppressed the children of Israel. So the Canaanites had weapons, they had chariots, they had iron. The Israelites didn't have a shield or a spear among them. In verse 4, now Deborah, a woman who was a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, she was judging Israel at that time. She was sitting as judge under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the country of Ephraim. And the children of Israel went up to her for judgment. So here is a woman who listens to Yahweh and speaks to Yahweh. That's what a prophetess is and does. And she was judging, and people knew where she was. She was under a tree that was even named after herself, a palm tree. So people would come to her to hear guidance from the Lord. They would come to her for dispute settlement, for helping them think through and solve their problems. So she was a wise woman and a woman of some considerable authority for that day and time. And then in verse 6, and she sent and called Barak, the son of Abinoam, out of Kadesh, Naphtali, and said to him, hasn't Yahweh, the God of Israel, commanded you? Go and deploy your troops at Mount Tabor and take with you 10,000 men of the children of Naphtali and of the children of Zebulun. Naphtali and Zebulun were two of the 12 tribes. So here she's hearing from God saying, go tell Barak, didn't I already tell you to go to battle against these people? And so she's saying, basically, get off your duffer and do what God has already told you to do. And then in verse 7, she's actually quoting Yahweh, and I will deploy against you at the brook of Kishon, Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army with his chariots and his multitude, and I will give him into your hand. So God had already promised Barak that he could go into battle and be victorious, and Barak was dragging his feet a little bit. So God told Deborah, stir up Barak. Tell him I said, go, it's time. And Barak said to her in verse 8, if you'll go with me, then I'll go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. And this is not exactly a statement of cowardice on Barak's part. It was not uncommon for the men of Israel to take a prophet or a seer into battle with them, or to have them accompany nearby. What's unusual about this is that Deborah's a woman, and it would have been very unusual for a woman to be near the battlefield. So we'll skip down to, then she says in verse 9, and she said, I'll go, yes, go with you, but it will not be your glory on the road on which you're going, because Yahweh will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. And she's speaking that by revelation. And Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. So Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali together to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up at his feet, and Deborah went with them. And then let's hop down to verse 13. So Sisera called together all his chariots. Now he's the Canaanite general, even 900 chariots of iron, and all the people who were with him to go from Harosheth Haggayim to the brook Kishon. And then Deborah said to Barak, "Arise, this is the day in which Yahweh has given Sisera into your hand." So Deborah is the one who launched the battle, who told Barak okay, it's now. Now is the time, you're going to go. And Sisera, has not Yahweh gone out before you? Verse 14. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men behind him. And Yahweh threw Sisera and all his chariots and all his army into a panic with the mouth of the sword before Barak. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. But Barak pursued after the chariots and after the army to Harosheth Haggayim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the mouth of the sword, and there was not a man left. So Yahweh brought the victory. We see from another place in the scriptures that Yahweh caused a confusion and a mud, basically a mud bog, and the chariots got all bogged down and all of that. So anyway, it was a wonderful victory for the Israelites. And just to recap or kind of summarize for you what happened with Sisera, the general of the Canaanites, he left his chariot and fled and ended up in the tent of a woman named Jael. And he violated a whole series of very important customs of the day, even by being in the tent of a woman when she was there alone. And anyway, she gave him, he asked for water, she gave him milk, he went to sleep, and she drove a tent peg through his head, killed him. So that fulfilled the prophecy of Deborah that Sisera would fall at the hand of the woman, and so Barak wouldn't have the glory of the battle for himself. And you might ask, how does a woman drive a tent peg through the skull of a man? Well, the women were responsible culturally for setting up and taking down the tents, and the tent pegs were very long. They weren't like little pup tent, like we pitch our little canvas or tents in the U.S. when we go camping. These were huge, long tent pegs, and the women were strong and were used to pounding them. So she drove a tent peg. This was Jael through Sisera's head. And then go back to chapter 5 in Judges, and I want to read the very last verse of that chapter. This is the end of Deborah's song, her victory song after that battle. So let all your enemies perish, O Yahweh, but let those who love him be like the sun when it rises in its strength. And then the land had rest for 40 years. So in this record, Deborah was the sun who arose in her strength. And she certainly ran to the darkness and held out her candle and took very decisive and quick action as a result of her trust. So that's Deborah, a mother in Israel. And the last record that I want to share is in 2 Samuel chapter 20. And again, so this is the mother that is actually a city, but it's also the record of a very wise woman who kept that city from utter destruction. Yeah, 2 Samuel chapter 20. So here's a little bit of background. David was king in Israel, and a man named Joab was his general. And there were periods of time during David's reign where there was a series of rebellions, one of the more significant ones led by David's own son, Absalom. This occurs this particular record occurs after that, but the damage that Absalom did in David's kingdom was to illustrate that rebellion was possible. And already at that time, starting to sow seeds of division between the northern part of Israel and the southern part of Israel. The 10 tribes that formed the northernmost parts of Israel, and the 2 tribes later called Judah that formed the southern part of Israel. And this 2 Samuel 20 is also, it's a record of a subsequent rebellion. And we'll start in verse 1. There had come there, and this to Israel, or to the area around Jerusalem, a man of Belial, whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjamite, and he blew the shofar and said, "We have no portion in David, and we have no inheritance in this son of Jesse." That's David. David's father was Jesse. "Every man to his tents, O Israel." So all the men of Israel went up from following David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah, the southern part of Israel, stayed by their king from the Jordan all the way to Jerusalem. So who is this person, Sheba, a man of Belial? What that's saying is he's a child of the devil, literally a child of the devil. He had accepted the devil as his god. And he was son of Bichri. He was a Benjamite. Benjamin is one of the 2 southern tribes. So here's a man from right in David's backyard, right out, Jerusalem is in the tribal area of Benjamin, who is going to launch this rebellion, and who had so abandoned Yahweh that he had become a son of Satan. So he's gathering up all these people from the northern part of Israel, and he's saying, "We're done with David. We're going to rebel. Everybody follow me. We're going to set up our own kingdom." And then we're going to skip all the way down to verse 14. So what did Sheba do? Sheba, went through all the tribes of Israel, that's northern part, to Abel and to Beth Makkah. Those are cities. Well, that's one city. And all the Berites, they were gathered together and went after him also. Let me just real quick, Rob, can I share my screen? Do I have permission? Because it's just so meaningful to see the context geographically of what's going on here. Thank you. So I'm going to share my screen, and here is what I want to show you. Okay, so here you can see Judah is this light purple, and it's the southern part of Israel, and what's green are the northern tribes. So this guy, Sheba, who was from right close to Jerusalem, this would be the tribal area of Benjamin in here, and he decided he's going to travel north through Israel, gathering rebels and amassing an army. And he went all the way up to here, which is Abel, Beth Makkah. And it's one city that we're going to see about. So he's gathered a whole lot, covered a lot of territory, and gathered a lot of his army in the process. And then he goes into the city of Abel, Beth Makkah. So they came, verse 15, they came and besieged him in Abel Beth Makkah. Now it's a change of subject. This is Joab and his army who came out of Jerusalem. Joab is David's top general, and they're following Sheba up through Israel, and they end up in Abel Beth Makkah because they know that he's in there. And so they besiege the city. They put up a siege ramp against the city, and it stood against its rampart. So this city, Abel Beth Makkah, was very well established. It was a walled city. and it had a lot of inhabitants. But they built this giant siege ramp right up to the wall of the city, and all the people who were with Joab were wreaking destruction and to make the wall fall down. So they want to ransack this city because they're looking for this one man who is leading this rebellion. And then a wise woman cried out of the city, listen, please say to Joab, come near here and let me speak with you. And the way I picture this is she's talking from the top of the wall, and she's shouting down to Joab's people, would someone go find Joab? I would like to speak with him. And verse 17, he came near to her, and the woman said, are you Joab? And he answered, I am. And then she said to him, listen to the words of your servant. An expression of humility. Interesting way to approach. Now, note that she went right to the top of the top. She wasn't going to deal with any, midline officer. She wanted to know, I want Joab. I want to talk to the man who is in charge of this horrible operation. And then she says, listen to the words of your servant. So expressing to Joab a level of humility. And he answered, I'm listening. And then she spoke, saying, they used to say, yes, say, in former times. Let them ask, yes, ask, counsel at Abel. And so they ended the matter. And these repetitions, say, yes, say, ask, yes, ask, and we'll see one in Joab's response as well, are they're figures of speech of emphasis, and they indicate the intensity of this conversation. And what she's saying is she's speaking on behalf of her city, saying, look, this is a place of wonderful reputation. This is a place where the people of Israel would come from around the city and come inside and settle disputes. This is a place where wise, faithful people live. And then verse 19, she says, I am among those who are peaceful and faithful in Israel. You seek to destroy a city and a mother in Israel, referring to the fact that this beautiful city full of wise, honest, faithful, peaceable people is a mother to all of that northern part of Israel around it. Why will you swallow up the inheritance of Yahweh? So she's expressing that Yahweh honors this beautiful city of Abel Beth Makkah. Why would you swallow this up? So she's really approaching Joab from a point of, you better really think about what you're doing here. and Joab answered, whoa, well, far be it from me that I should swallow up or destroy. But that's not how it is. A man of the hill country of Ephraim, Sheba, the son of Bichri by name, has lifted up his hand against the king, against David. Give up him only, and I will go from the city. So the woman said to Joab, behold, his head will be thrown to you over the wall. This is a woman of some authority, some sphere of influence, and some power, undaunted by a warrior who happens to be a spiritually powerful man himself, although working for the wrong side. And yet she just makes this confident statement. And then in verse 22, then the woman went to all the people in her wisdom. She had a sphere of influence in the city. They cut off the head of Sheba, the son of Bichri, and threw it to Joab. He blew the shofar, and they dispersed from the city, every man to his tent, and Joab returned to Jerusalem, the king. So that is the record of a city called a mother in Israel. and a woman who ran to the darkness, about literally in this case. And it was her courageous action and her trust in Yahweh that protected this wonderful walled city from utter destruction for the sake of one evil person. So hopefully these records have been inspiring and have called out your your trust in Yahweh and your desire to hold out your candle and run to the darkness that's around you. So have a wonderful, wonderful Mother's Day.